I still remember the day I first saw that white wooden cradle. I was 18 and had just followed James home for Thanksgiving break from college, nervous about meeting his parents. They had this wonderful old house on the outskirts of town, and hidden away in the attic was a cradle carved by James's great-grandfather. Its paint had chipped along the edges, and the rockers squeaked if you pressed down on them. But it had a softness to it, a history I could practically sense when I ran my hand along the curved rails. His mother said it had carried 4 generations of Thompsons, including James. I remember imagining, maybe for the first time in my life, what it would be like to have a child of my own. Back then, I was just a college sophomore pursuing an education degree. James was studying law, determined to become the hotshot attorney in his family. We were so young, so idealistic. If you'd told me that cradle would become a symbol of both my dreams and my heartbreak one day, I might have laughed. Yet, here I am now, standing in the doorway of what used to be the nursery, telling you how that cradle changed my life. I'll start at the moment I realized something was wrong inside me. It was just a whisper, like a faint voice in the back of my mind, telling me I wasn't quite satisfied. I had 2 beautiful children, Liam, 7, with his father's dark eyes and quiet determination, and Ellie, 5, all curls and giggles, with her brilliant imagination. I loved my kids beyond measure. I loved James, too. He worked long hours as an associate at a high-stakes law firm downtown, and we had a comfortable enough life in our suburban home. Yet my heart ached for something more. I found myself standing in the doorway of the nursery at odd times, usually around midnight, when James was still at the office or had just come home, exhausted and slumped on the couch. The nursery was empty now. Ellie had moved out years ago, and the wall still carried faint outlines of the stars I'd painted for her when I was pregnant. The cradle sat in the corner, blanketed in moonlight. Sometimes I'd step inside, place one hand on the curved edge, and imagine another baby lying there, cooing, reaching out for me. I fantasized about the warmth of a tiny body against my chest, the smell of that sweet newborn breath. I was ashamed of my longing sometimes. Didn't I have enough? God had blessed me with 2 healthy children, a loving husband, a house that rarely wanted for anything. But the ache in my chest wouldn't go away. So I began to pray, quietly, asking God if there was something He wanted me to see. It was around that time I started reading Psalm 23 again, the same words I'd clung to during my first pregnancy with Liam. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. I'd always found comfort in them. This time, though, they seemed to tease me. Did I truly believe I shall not want? Because it felt like I wanted plenty. One night, James came home a little before midnight, early for him. I was in the nursery, standing by the cradle, tears in my eyes. He loosened his tie, stepped up behind me, and put a hand gently on my shoulder. "Anna," he said, voice weary. "You're here again." I couldn't deny it. My fingers were curled around the worn wood. "I'm sorry," I whispered. "I know it's late." He sighed. I noticed the dark circles under his eyes, the slump in his shoulders. I knew he was worried about money, about the workload, about not being able to provide the life he thought we deserved. "We agreed," he began, "that this room would make sense as a home office. I can't keep working in the dining room. I need a quiet space." He paused, searching my face. "We talked about that 6 months ago, remember?" I brushed the tears away and let go of the cradle. We never fully agreed, James. I asked if we could hold off a while. I wasn't ready. Anna, it's been years since Ellie moved out of here. We're paying so much in daycare, after-school programs. You know the budget is tight. And this cradle... He paused, fighting to find the right words. I'm sorry, but it's just collecting dust. I turned away from him, my heart lurching. I knew he was right about the practicalities, but it felt like he was pushing me to give up on something precious, something that reminded me of my own sense of hope. James, I said, my voice trembling. I just need more time. He didn't have a response for that. Instead, he just gave me a sad look, rubbed my shoulder once, and disappeared down the hallway. In the distance, I heard the muffled sounds of Liam and Ellie giggling in their shared bedroom, their joy echoing through the walls. For a moment, I thought, isn't that enough? But then I felt the emptiness in my arms again, and knew that for me, right now, it wasn't. The argument about the nursery simmered under the surface for weeks, like an unspoken tension in the house. We'd mention it in passing. He'd talk about the new computer desk he wanted, or I'd mention a sale on cribs I saw at the department store. Little jabs, little remarks that built a wall between us. It all came to a head one evening over dinner. I'd spent an hour making lasagna, but the top burned under the broiler when I got distracted by Ellie, who insisted on dancing in the kitchen. By the time James got home, he was in a terrible mood. His boss at the firm had assigned him yet another major case, meaning more late nights and weekends at work. We sat down at the table. Liam complaining about the black edges on his lasagna, Ellie picking at the melted cheese. James took a bite, grimaced, and slammed his fork down. For the love of... This is burnt, Anna. I remember feeling tears prick at the corners of my eyes. Not just for the lasagna, but for the deeper issue. I'm sorry, I said quietly, forcing myself not to snap. It's been a busy day, and I lost track. James exhaled loudly. It's not just about dinner, okay? I'm working my tail off, and I come home to tension. To you standing in that nursery every night. I'm trying to keep us afloat, but you keep talking about having another baby. Or you keep that cradle around like some shrine. We can't afford it. Anna, it's not just money, he clarified, seeing my expression. But that's part of it. I set my napkin down, carefully. My pulse pounded in my ears. God has always provided for us. He's never let us down before. James scoffed, glancing at Liam and Ellie, who looked up with worried expressions. God doesn't sign my paychecks, he muttered, voice low. I do. That was all it took for me to snap. You think it's all on your shoulders? That I'm not contributing anything? That faith means nothing in the face of spreadsheets and budgets? Liam's eyes flicked to Ellie, and she whispered, Daddy, why are you yelling at Mommy? It was enough to break my heart. In my peripheral vision, I saw how small and scared Ellie looked, her curly hair framing her round face, her eyes wide with confusion. James sighed heavily, rubbed his temples, and pushed away from the table. I'm not doing this right now, he said. I can't. He walked out of the dining room, leaving half his meal uneaten. I forced a shaky smile for the kids, telling them it was fine, that Daddy was just tired. But inside, I felt a wrenching guilt. I hated that they had to see us fighting. A voice in my head whispered, that maybe we should let the cradle go, turn that room into an office, find some new normal. But that same evening, after I put Liam and Ellie to bed, I wandered back into the nursery. Instead of feeling peaceful, I felt lost, hollow. Tears came, unbidden and unstoppable. I sat in the corner with my knees drawn up, pressing my face against the wall, hating the tension that had woven itself through our once happy home. The following day, my friend Kathy invited me to St. Mary's Chapel for a midday prayer. Kathy and I had known each other since college. She was a year older than me, with a level-headed wisdom I'd always admired. When I entered the chapel, I was amazed at how quiet it was, the bright daylight streaming through coloured glass, casting gentle rainbows on the floor. I found Kathy waiting for me in a pew near the front. I slid in next to her, cheeks still damp from crying in the car. She took one look at me and squeezed my hand. "Anna," she said softly, "you look like you haven't slept in days." I swallowed. "I haven't," I admitted. "Not really." For a moment, we sat in a companionable silence, the echo of prayerful whispers drifting through the sanctuary. Then I reached into my bag and pulled out a small, well-worn Bible, flipping to Psalm 23. I'd circled words in pencil, underlined entire verses over the years. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want," I began to read, voice barely above a whisper. "He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters." Kathy listened quietly, her own eyes glistening. "You've always loved that passage," she said when I finished. "What does it mean to you right now?" I closed my eyes, inhaling slowly. "It used to be a reassurance," I said. "It reminded me that God was guiding us, through pregnancy, through early motherhood, through finances. Now it feels like it's mocking me. I want so badly. Another child, another chance." Kathy turned her gaze toward the stained glass window, showing a lamb cradled in the arms of a shepherd. Light poured through it, painting the pews with vivid blues and greens and golds. "Sometimes," she said, "the shepherd leads us to a place we don't expect, and sometimes that place is a valley." She turned back to me. "Maybe he's not leading you to another cradle, Anna. Maybe he's leading you to a deeper understanding of your faith, one that doesn't rely on fulfilling every wish." Her words stung more than I wanted to admit. It was easier to assume that my longing was God's will, that all I needed was to pray hard enough or wait patiently for James to come around. But maybe there was a different plan, one I couldn't see yet. Still, I couldn't ignore the aching emptiness in my heart. "What if the valley is all there is?" I asked, my voice cracking. "What if there's no child waiting for me at the end of this journey?" Kathy reached out, resting her hand on top of mine. "Then trust that he'll guide you through it," she said simply. No matter what form it takes. I wasn't sure I could do that, but I forced myself to nod, as if I believed it wholeheartedly. We prayed together, letting the comforting hush of the chapel seep into my bones. When I walked out an hour later, I felt marginally lighter, but my questions still weighed heavily on my mind, especially how James fit into all of this. He was my partner, yet we seemed so far apart in spirit these days. It was as if each of us was carrying different burdens, never fully sharing them. That night, James came home, earlier than usual. I think he could sense how strained things were. I'd put Liam and Ellie to bed, and the house was quiet. except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant rumble of traffic outside. I was in the nursery, but this time I wasn't hovering over the cradle. I had dragged some boxes in from the garage and was packing away old baby clothes and blankets, the ones I'd insisted on keeping for just in case. James froze in the doorway, his tie undone, his suit jacket slung over his arm. He looked around the room and saw me folding a tiny pink onesie with trembling hands. It was the same onesie I'd bought when I was pregnant with Ellie, before I even knew she was a girl. The color had faded slightly, but it still held so many memories. I called the donation center, I said, my voice surprisingly steady. They'll pick this stuff up tomorrow. James set his jacket on the floor and approached slowly, as if he were afraid of startling me. You're giving it all away? I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. It's time, I think. He looked at me for a long moment, then at the cradle. The sadness in his eyes mirrored my own. Anna, he whispered, I never wanted to hurt you. I brushed away tears. I know, I managed to say, but it hurts anyway. Suddenly, he reached for my hand. His grip was warm, firm. I'm scared too, he admitted, voice cracking. I'm scared of failing you, of failing the kids, of not being able to protect us if something goes wrong financially. If we add another baby and I can't handle it, then what? I can barely handle my workload as it is. I stared at him, heart pounding. In that moment, I realized how lonely he'd been in his own fears. I'd been so consumed by my longing that I hadn't seen how burdened he was. You're not alone, I whispered. I'm right here, you know. He squeezed my hand. I know that, but I also know I'm supposed to be strong for you, for Liam and Ellie. This is how I grew up. My dad always taught me that a man's job is to provide, to keep everyone safe. And I'm trying, but I feel like I'm failing on all fronts. His vulnerability broke me. I dropped the onesie, stepped forward, and wrapped my arms around him, pressing my face into his chest. I could feel the thudding of his heart through his shirt. James, I said, voice muffled. We don't have to have all the answers right now. Maybe the cradle can go. Maybe it's for the best. But don't shut me out. Don't go through this alone. We stood there for what felt like a long time, the moonlight filtering through the curtains. Finally, James pulled back just enough to look into my eyes. I'm sorry about the fight, about the things I said. I offered him a small, watery smile. Me too. That night, we didn't argue. We sat together on the floor, backs against the nursery wall, an open box of baby clothes beside us. James opened a bottle of Merlot, poured 2 glasses, and we sipped in a hushed intimacy, letting the tension of the past few weeks dissolve into a quiet sense of mutual understanding. I kept dreaming about her, I confessed at one point, my voice barely above a whisper. A little girl with your love. I called her Grace. James closed his eyes. You never told me that, I shrugged, tears glistening. I didn't think you wanted to hear it. He took a shaky breath. The night Ellie was born, I prayed I'd never let you down. And now, with all this fear, I feel like I already have. I press my hand against his chest, where a small pendant of Psalm 23 hung from a chain. He'd worn it since our wedding day, a gift from his mother. Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, I murmured. He covered my hand with his. What if Grace isn't a child? He said softly, eyes searching mine. What if Grace is something else we need in our lives right now? I let the question linger. I didn't have an answer, but the possibility opened a new door in my heart. Maybe the shepherd was leading me somewhere unexpected, as Kathy had suggested. Maybe the cradle wasn't the only way to receive his blessings. The next morning, the donation truck arrived at dawn. I was in my robe, hair still messy, when two workers came to the door. They were polite, smiling faintly, as I led them to the nursery. Each step down the hallway felt heavy, like a funeral march. James stood behind me, his hand resting on my shoulder for support. When they lifted the cradle, I felt this surge of panic, as though a piece of my identity was being ripped away. That cradle carried so many memories. Rocking Liam to sleep in it, draping pastel blankets over its sides for Ellie, singing lullabies in the dead of night. Part of me wanted to scream at them to put it down and leave. Instead, I simply nodded, letting them carry it off. James's fingers squeezed mine gently, grounding me. I followed them outside, watched them load the cradle into the truck. The morning sun was just barely cresting over the roofline, painting the sky in delicate hues of pink and orange. For a heartbeat, I almost asked them to stop. But then I remembered James's confession the night before. His fear, his yearning for a sense of peace. I closed my eyes. Let go, I told myself. Once the truck was gone, James and I stood together on the front porch. The chill of the morning air bit at our skin, but neither of us moved. Finally, he turned to me and brushed the hair away from my face. "Are you okay?" he asked. I wasn't sure how to answer. "I don't know," I admitted. "Empty, maybe?" He nodded, understanding. "We'll figure it out, somehow." That weekend, we decided to take Liam and Ellie to the river. It was a spot we'd loved before kids. A quiet stretch of shoreline where the water ran clear over smooth rocks, and you could skip stones to your heart's content. James packed a small picnic, and I made sure the kids had their rain boots and jackets. The sky was steel grey when we arrived, the promise of rain in the air, but it felt peaceful to be there as a family. Liam raced to the water's edge, searching for perfect skipping stones. Ellie twirled in her pink boots, dancing along the muddy bank, her laughter ringing out like bells. Watching them, I felt a twinge in my heart, mourning the child I'd imagined. But I also felt gratitude. I had so much already. James wandered over to me, hands in his pockets, gaze on the rushing water. "I've been thinking," he said quietly, "about all this, about us." I tucked my hair behind my ear and looked at him. "Yeah? Your friend Kathy mentioned fostering to us once, didn't she? When we were at church a while back." My eyes widened. Yes, she did. She's been fostering for a couple years now, off and on. I remembered how Kathy had shared stories about the children who came through her home, each one bearing scars, physical, emotional, or both. She'd said it was challenging and heartbreaking, but also deeply fulfilling. James rocked on his heels, eyes drifting toward Liam and Ellie. "I'm not saying it would replace Grace or anything like that," he clarified softly. "But maybe we could open our home to a child who needs love. Someone who's already here, in this world, maybe feeling lost or alone." I let his words settle over me. My initial reaction was a swirl of emotions. excitement, fear, apprehension, hope. Fostering wasn't something to be taken lightly. It required emotional strength, financial stability, willingness to handle heartbreak if a child returned to their biological family. But the seed he was planting sparked something inside me. We'd need to pray about it, I said finally, my voice tremulous. Really pray? He nodded. I know. But maybe this is part of that grace we've been missing. A tear slipped down my cheek, but I smiled through it. My cup runneth over, I whispered, quoting Psalm 23. In that moment, as I watched my kids laugh and watched James's thoughtful profile, I realized something. The cradle might be empty, but that didn't mean my heart had to be. In the weeks that followed, life took on a new rhythm. James and I cleared out the nursery completely, setting up a modest home office for him. It felt odd at first. Where once the cradle had sat, now there was a sleek wooden desk and a rolling chair. The pastel stars on the walls were painted over with a neutral cream color. I had to wrestle with my emotions every time I passed that room, but little by little, I grew used to it. With James working from home a couple days a week, the tension about finances began to ease. He was more present for family dinners, more involved with the kids' homework, more engaged in conversations that didn't revolve around budgets or bills. I made an appointment for us to speak with a local fostering agency. We had a long, honest conversation with a social worker named Carla, who explained the licensing process, the training, and the emotional realities of bringing a foster child into our home. There's no guarantee, she said gently, that the child will stay with you permanently. Our ultimate goal is reunification with their biological parents if it's safe. You need to be prepared for that heartbreak. James squeezed my hand under the table. We understand, he said, meeting her gaze. I nodded, even though my stomach fluttered with nerves. We left the appointment with a massive folder of information. Before we even got to the car, James pulled me aside. Are we sure about this, Anna? I mean, really sure? His eyes searched mine, full of both hope and worry. I thought about the cradle, about the child I'd yearned for, about how Psalm 23 had led me into this strange valley. I'm sure, I said, though my voice wavered. I feel like maybe this is how our family is supposed to grow. He released a slow breath, relief coloring his features. Okay, he murmured, pressing a soft kiss to my temple. Then let's do it. Together. As part of the preparation process, we had to take a series of training classes. They were held at a community center downtown every Thursday evening for 6 weeks. Kathy offered to watch Liam and Ellie for us so we could attend without interruptions. Each class covered a different topic: trauma-informed care, discipline strategies, the legal aspects of fostering, and so on. We heard testimonies from current foster parents about the ups and downs, losing kids back to unsafe environments, or celebrating successful reunifications, or even adopting children who had no other place to go. One evening, a woman named Teresa spoke to the group. She had tears in her eyes as she recounted fostering a 9-year-old girl who'd been removed from her mother's care. It was brutal at first, she admitted, voice shaking. This child had seen things no kid should ever see. She acted out, she screamed, she broke things. But we kept praying, kept loving her. Eventually, she began to trust us. And the day she finally called me Mom, I can't describe that feeling. I glanced at James. His eyes were moist, and he squeezed my knee under the folding table. For all our fears, hearing these stories reminded us of why we were taking this path. There were children out there who needed security and love, and though my arms still longed for a baby at times, I realized more and more that any child, baby, toddler, teenager, deserved a chance at stability. Maybe that was the missing piece of grace we'd been seeking. During this time, I was also navigating changes within myself. I started volunteering at the church's youth group on Wednesday nights, thinking that helping teenagers might prepare me for the challenges of fostering. I found myself drawn to a shy 14-year-old girl named Brianna, who came from a rough neighborhood and often hid behind layers of oversized hoodies. She barely spoke, but she'd nod politely when I offered her snacks or asked how her week was going. Slowly, I saw her open up to another volunteer about her struggles at home. Each time she did, I saw a flicker of hope in her eyes, like she was testing the waters to see if we'd reject her. We never did. I'd go home on those nights, thinking about how many kids out there carry unimaginable burdens, and I'd think of my own cradle, now gone, wondering if my desire for a baby had been overshadowing a bigger calling, to reach out to the children already in need. James noticed the shift in me. He'd watch me come in from youth group, eyes bright with new perspective. He started asking questions about the kids, about what they were like. Gradually, as we talked, I sensed we were forging a deeper bond, a mutual sense of purpose beyond our own family. We prayed together more often, not just for ourselves, but for these children who needed help. Despite the growing unity, we weren't immune to setbacks. One Friday night, about a month after the cradle was donated, James came home late again. He found me in the living room, reading a brochure about fostering siblings. Liam and Ellie were tucked in, asleep. The house was quiet except for the low hum of the dishwasher. James threw his keys on the table, ran a hand through his hair, and sank onto the couch beside me. "There's talk of layoffs at the firm," he said, voice grim. "I don't know how big the cuts will be, but I'm not a partner. I'm definitely at risk." I set the brochure aside, my heart thudding. "Oh, James," he exhaled shakily. "I'm trying not to panic, but if I lose my job, how are we supposed to foster? How do we keep afloat?" I didn't have a simple answer. The stress was palpable. My mind raced. Could I pick up extra hours tutoring? Could we downsize? We were still paying off James's student loans, and though we managed our money carefully, a layoff could devastate us. That night, we prayed together, kneeling beside the couch, hands entwined. I asked God to help us trust in His plan, whatever it might be. It felt vulnerable, throwing ourselves at the mercy of a future we couldn't control. But with every whispered prayer, a calmness began to settle over me. "Maybe this is another test," I said, wiping away tears. "Another valley to walk through." James didn't reply, but I felt his arm tighten around my shoulders, as if to say he would stand with me no matter what happened. Over the next few weeks, we waited for news from his firm. It was agonizing, the not knowing. James was jumpy and prone to snapping at small things. Ellie spilled orange juice on the counter one morning, and he barked at her with a sharpness I rarely heard. She burst into tears, and I hurried to console her, shooting James a worried glance. He ran a frustrated hand across his face, guilt flashing in his eyes. After Ellie had calmed down, he came to me. I'm turning into my father, he muttered darkly. No, I said softly, taking his hand. You're just scared. It's okay to be scared. He swallowed and nodded. That night, he made it a point to read Ellie an extra bedtime story, apologizing with kisses on her forehead. I stood in the hallway, listening to his voice drift through the door, tears stinging my eyes. Fostering a child. How could we do that in the midst of all this stress? Yet something inside me refused to give up. My gut told me that these trials might be shaping us, preparing us to be stronger, more compassionate parents. Eventually, the news came. James's job was safe. A wave of relief swept over both of us. He'd kept his position, though many co-workers were let go. That same night, we hosted a small celebratory dinner at home. Liam and Ellie made homemade cards for Daddy. Silly drawings of James in a superhero cape, labelled Super Dad. We feasted on spaghetti and meatballs, talking and laughing more freely than we had in months. In a moment of warmth, Ellie asked, So, does this mean you and Mommy aren't upset anymore? Her big eyes searched our faces, longing for reassurance. James and I exchanged glances. We're still working through things, I told her, reaching to tuck a curl behind her ear. But we're good, sweetheart. We love you and Liam more than anything. That night, once the kids were in bed, James and I curled up on the living room sofa. The tension that had defined our conversation seemed to have eased. I looked at him, thinking about how far we'd come since the day I stood in the nursery, clinging to that cradle. We should probably tell Carla we're ready to move forward with the fostering paperwork, I said tentatively. James nodded. Yeah, I think so too. Our smiles held both excitement and a touch of trepidation, but at least we were on the same page. In the ensuing months, we completed the foster licensing process. We passed the home study, which was both nerve-wracking and enlightening. A social worker came to our house multiple times, interviewing each of us. Yes, even Liam and Ellie, about our motivations, our parenting styles, our discipline methods. We had to prove we were financially stable, that we had enough room in our home, which meant converting the guest room, not the old nursery, into a possible child space. By the end of it, we had official approval to foster. Our caseworker told us it might take time to place a child with us, especially since we'd indicated a willingness to take in older kids, not just infants. The call could come at any hour, or it could be months. There was no telling. Meanwhile, life marched on. Liam turned 8, and Ellie turned 6. We threw a joint birthday party at a local trampoline park. James managed to snag a calmer schedule at the firm, at least temporarily. I found myself reflecting on how different things were from just a year ago. The cradle was gone, but our hearts had opened in ways I never expected. Finally, one Thursday afternoon, the call came. I was folding laundry when my phone vibrated. The display read Carla, Foster Agency, and my stomach did a nervous flip. I set down the towel and took a deep breath before answering. Carla's voice was calm but urgent. Anna, we have a situation. A 6-year-old boy named Marcus needs a temporary placement. His grandmother, who was his guardian, just had a stroke. No other relatives can take him right now, and we can't reach his mother. We don't have full details yet, but we need a home by tonight. My heart pounded. 6 years old. That was Ellie's age. I felt a swirl of anxiety and excitement. Tonight? I repeated. We understand it's short notice, but that's how foster care can be, Carla explained. Would you and James be willing to take him in, at least for a few days until we figure out a more permanent arrangement? I glanced at the clock. 3:12 p.m. Liam and Ellie would be home from school soon. My mind raced. Where would he sleep? Did we have enough groceries? Was this the right time to say yes? Then I felt a stirring inside me. A nudge, almost like a quiet voice, telling me this was the path we'd been preparing for. Yes, I said, voice steadier than I felt. We'll make it work. Bring him. After hanging up, I sat on the couch, laundry forgotten, tears of both joy and fear prickling my eyes. This was it, the next chapter of our story. I texted James. They need us. 6-year-old boy, name is Marcus, coming tonight. He replied immediately, on my way home. We can do this. That evening, we waited by the window, hearts pounding. Liam and Ellie were abuzz with questions. Who is Marcus? What games does he like? Will he share my Legos? James and I tried to temper their excitement, explaining that Marcus might be scared or sad. He was going through something we didn't fully understand yet. Around 7 p.m., a white sedan pulled into our driveway. Carla stepped out, followed by a small boy clutching a plastic bag. He had short, curly black hair and wore a threadbare jacket. His eyes were wide with apprehension. I opened the front door, my heart in my throat. Hi, Marcus, I said softly, crouching down to his eye level. I'm Anna. He hugged the plastic bag against his chest, silent. Carla placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. Marcus, these are the Thompsons, she said kindly. They're going to take care of you for a little while, okay? James appeared beside me, offering a quiet smile. Hey, buddy, I'm James. We have 2 kids, Liam and Ellie, and they're both really excited to meet you. Marcus nodded once, still tight-lipped. I stood and showed him inside, trying to keep my voice gentle and welcoming. You must be hungry. We have some pizza in the oven if you want any. He didn't respond, just followed me into the living room, where Liam and Ellie waited. Ellie waved shyly. Hi, she piped up. Want to see my toys? Marcus just shrugged. I could see fear in his eyes, the weight of confusion. My heart lurched, and I remembered Kathy's words about valleys and trust. This was a valley for Marcus. His grandmother in the hospital, no stable home. I resolved to do my best to make him feel safe. Carla spent a few minutes going over some paperwork with James, handing me a small folder of Marcus's scant medical records. We learned that he had mild asthma, carried an inhaler, and that the hospital staff had found a note in his grandmother's purse, designating her as his guardian. We don't know much else, Carla said, apologetic. His grandmother is still in critical condition. We're trying to contact his mother. Until then, he needs a place to stay. After Carla left, the house felt both crowded and strangely quiet. I tried to get Marcus to eat some pizza. He picked at it, nibbling the cheese. Liam asked if he wanted to play a board game, but he just shook his head. Ellie showed him her plush unicorn, but Marcus barely looked up. I didn't blame him. Everything in his life had just been uprooted. That night, I led him to the guest bedroom, now temporarily his room, and showed him fresh pajamas I dug out of Liam's old clothes. Here you go, I said softly, placing them on the bed. They might be a little big, but they're comfy. And I put some clean towels in the bathroom if you want a bath or shower. He stood in the doorway, eyes darting around. Finally, he whispered, "I miss my grandma." A wave of compassion washed over me. "I know," I said, voice tight with sympathy. "I'm so sorry you're going through this. I'm sure she loves you very much. Will take good care of you until she feels better." Marcus's eyes brimmed with tears. He set down his plastic bag. It contained a few clothing items, a toothbrush, and a small stuffed turtle that had seen better days. Without warning, he bolted across the room and threw his arms around my waist, sobbing into my shirt. My heart twisted. I held him, running my hand over his back, murmuring soft words I hoped would comfort him. "It's okay," I said, my voice trembling. "You're safe here." It took a while for him to calm down. Eventually, his sobs subsided into sniffles. I helped him change into the pajamas, then tucked him into bed. I grabbed a nightlight from Ellie's room and plugged it in, casting a gentle glow. He gripped his stuffed turtle tightly. "Good night, Marcus," I whispered, brushing the hair from his forehead. "We'll be right here if you need anything." He didn't respond, but his eyes, swollen from crying, fluttered shut. I tiptoed out, leaving the door cracked. James waited in the hallway. A look of concern etched across his face. "Is he okay?" he asked quietly. "He's scared," I said, tears burning the back of my eyes. "Poor kid. My voice broke. I want him to feel loved." James nodded, his own eyes suspiciously shiny. "We'll do our best." Over the next few days, we settled into a fragile routine. Marcus was withdrawn at first, barely speaking above a whisper. We took him to visit his grandmother in the hospital, but she was still mostly unresponsive. A relative we tracked down turned out to be unavailable. Days turned into a week, then 2. Slowly, Marcus began to open up. He started playing with Liam's Legos, building small forts and towers. Ellie taught him a clapping game she'd learned at school. I caught the faintest smile on his face once or twice. One afternoon, while I was doing laundry, I found Marcus sitting in the living room, staring at the Bible on the coffee table. He picked it up gently, flipping through pages. When he noticed me, he put it down, looking embarrassed. "You can look at it," I said gently. He pointed to the gold-embossed letters on the spine. "My grandma read to me from the Bible," he murmured. "She always said God would watch over me." My throat tightened. "She's right," I whispered, fighting back tears. "He will." Marcus nodded. We both fell silent, but the moment felt sacred, like a small step toward trust. Through it all, I kept going back to Psalm 23. Each night, after putting the kids to bed, James and I would share a cup of tea and reflect on the day. We were exhausted. Fostering tested our patience, our energy, our ability to adapt. But we felt more alive, more connected to each other and to something beyond ourselves. One evening, James surprised me by suggesting we read Psalm 23 aloud together. We sat on the couch, his arm around my shoulders, and he began to recite, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." I closed my eyes, absorbing the words. Once, they had tormented me, making me feel incomplete. Now, I was beginning to see them in a different light. Maybe I shall not want didn't mean never longing for anything. Maybe it meant trusting that, in the end, the shepherd would provide what we truly needed. Peace, guidance, love, even if it looked nothing like what we first imagined. When James finished reading, we sat for a moment in the hush of the living room. The only sound the gentle buzz of the overhead light. Then I leaned my head against his shoulder. "Thank you," I whispered, and I meant it for both him and God. Weeks turned into months, and Marcus was still with us. His grandmother had been transferred to a rehab facility, but her recovery was slow, and it was unclear if she could still care for him long term. The fostering agency suggested that Marcus might end up staying for a while, possibly until a more suitable, permanent relative was found, or until we stepped up to adopt, if that became an option, and if the courts allowed it. One Saturday afternoon, we took all 3 kids to the park. The sun was bright, a crisp autumn breeze rustling the changing leaves. Liam and Ellie raced for the swings, and Marcus hesitated before following. He had a small grin as Liam pushed him gently. James and I sat on a nearby bench, watching, hearts full. I turned to James. "Remember the cradle?" I asked softly, a pang of nostalgia hitting me. He nodded, his gaze fixed on the kids. "I do. I used to think it symbolized everything I wanted, everything I lacked," I confessed. "Now I realize how much we've gained by letting go." He wrapped an arm around me. "Sometimes you have to make space for blessings you don't anticipate." We watched Marcus pump his legs on the swing, glancing over at us as if seeking reassurance. We waved, and he offered a shy wave back. In that moment, I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. Maybe this was the grace we'd been yearning for all along. Yet life wasn't without its heartbreaking moments. One night, as I was tucking Marcus in, he held his stuffed turtle up to me. "Her name is Ella," he said quietly. "My mum gave her to me." I gently touched the turtle's frayed paw. "She's cute. Do you miss your mum?" He nodded, tears gathering in his eyes. "She left when I was 3. Grandma says she's trying to get better, but I don't know." I swallowed hard, not knowing what to say. No child should have to question their mother's love. I leaned in, hugging him gently. "I'm sorry," I whispered. "If you ever want to talk about it, I'm here." That night, I cried in bed, my face pressed to James's shoulder. These were the valleys Kathy had mentioned, the heartbreak we'd encounter by opening our home to a child in pain. But this time, I didn't feel hopeless. I felt determined to love him through it. Over time, our home began to feel less like a temporary shelter and more like a real family unit. Marcus started calling James Uncle James and me Auntie Anna, though we never insisted on any particular title. He and Ellie became inseparable, sharing crayons and bedtime stories. He and Liam bonded over video games, though Liam took some time to adjust to sharing his console. We invited Kathy over one Sunday for lunch, and she marveled at the transformation. "You can see the light in his eyes," she whispered to me in the kitchen as we prepared lemonade. "He's feeling safe." I smiled, thinking of how Psalm 23 often references still waters and green pastures. Maybe we were those green pastures for Marcus, a place to rest and restore. One crisp afternoon, about 6 months into Marcus's stay, I was going through old photo albums with him, Liam, and Ellie. They loved seeing pictures of themselves as babies, of me and James back in college, of family vacations. Suddenly, Marcus pointed to a photo I had tucked in the back of the album, the white wooden cradle taken long before Liam was born. "What's that?" he asked. I hesitated, my heart tugging. "It's an old cradle that used to be in our family," I explained. "It's gone now, though." He studied the picture. "Did I ever sleep in it?" he asked innocently, perhaps trying to fit into the family timeline. My throat closed up for a moment. "No," I managed. "You didn't, but Liam and Ellie did." He nodded slowly, as if processing. Then Ellie, in her sweet, guileless way, turned to him and said, "That's okay. You're here now. So it's kinda like you're part of our family anyway." Marcus gave a tentative smile. My eyes misted, out of the mouths of babes indeed. A year later, we got the news that Marcus's mother had resurfaced, seeking to regain custody. It was complicated. She was in rehab, had a long road of proving stability, but the social worker told us that if she met her requirements, Marcus might be returned to her. James and I sat down with Marcus to explain that his mom was trying to get better, that she loved him. He was quiet, obviously torn. He'd grown comfortable with us, yet he still missed her. We prayed fervently during that season. I recalled how I'd once dreaded not having another baby. But now, the potential heartbreak was of an entirely different kind. Losing a child I'd come to love as my own, even if it was the right thing for him in the long run. Then, 3 months later, we received word. Marcus's mom had relapsed, failing a required drug test. The courts determined he would remain in foster care long term. The social worker hinted that if we were willing, we could pursue adoption. My chest tightened. Could we? Would Marcus want us to? James and I talked late into the night. We considered the emotional impact on Liam and Ellie, on Marcus, on us. We prayed. We cried. In the end, we agreed to move forward, to give Marcus a permanent home, if that was what he wanted too. When we gently brought it up to Marcus, he seemed both relieved and sad. "Will I ever see my mum again?" he asked, eyes full of longing. "We hope so," I said gently. "But for now, this is your home. And we love you. We're not trying to replace your mum or your grandma. We just want you to be safe and part of our family." He nodded, tears glistening. Then he hugged me with a fierceness I hadn't felt from him before. "Okay," he whispered. "I want to stay." The adoption process wasn't quick or simple. We spent endless hours on legal paperwork, court hearings, evaluations. James's experience as a lawyer helped us navigate the system, but it was still emotionally draining. Through it all, Psalm 23 resonated in my soul. I had walked through a valley, yearning for something I thought would complete me. A baby of my own flesh and blood. Instead, I found an unexpected calling. Motherhood to a child who needed a safe place to land. Finally, one bright spring day, we stood in family court with Marcus by our side, signing papers that officially welcomed him into our family. Liam and Ellie were there too, wearing their best outfits, beaming proudly. Marcus was dressed in a crisp button-down shirt, looking both excited and nervous. When the judge asked Marcus if he understood he was becoming part of our family forever, he nodded vigorously. I had to blink back tears to keep from openly sobbing in the courtroom. Afterwards, we celebrated with ice cream. Marcus chose mint chocolate chip, his new favorite flavor. While we sat in the parlor, sticky and smiling, James clinked his plastic spoon against mine in a mock toast. To family, he said softly. All 5 of us. I felt a rush of gratitude so profound, I could barely speak. My cup truly runneth over. In the years that followed, we faced the usual challenges of raising 3 kids. Homework battles, sibling rivalries, teenage angst. Marcus kept in touch with his grandmother once she was well enough to call. And occasionally there were supervised visits with his mother when she was in a stable environment. Each time we navigated a flood of emotions. But we did it as a family. I never forgot the cradle or the longing it represented. Sometimes I'd wonder what might have been if we'd had another biological child. But mostly I focused on the fullness of life as it was. Our empty cradle had led us to a new understanding of parenthood. One that wasn't bound by blood, but by love, compassion, and the belief that God works in mysterious ways. Every so often, Kathy and I would meet at St. Mary's Chapel, and I'd sit in the same pew where I once cried out, "What if the valley is all there is?" Now, when I revisited the question, the answer glowed differently. The valley wasn't all there was, but even if it had been, God would still have led me through it. The shepherd's presence was never in doubt, not in the cradle, not in the tears, not in the uncertain nights or the anxious mornings. He had shown me a path I never imagined. Looking back, I see how each step of the journey shaped my faith and my family. The cradle's emptiness was a catalyst, forcing me to confront my hopes and fears. It strained my marriage, but ultimately drew James and me closer together as we learned to communicate, to share burdens. It led me to stand in St. Mary's Chapel, wrestling with the meaning of Psalm 23. It brought me to fostering, then to adoption, and ultimately to Marcus, a boy who needed parents as much as I needed to be a mother again. If you were to ask me now what happened to that cradle, I'd tell you it went on to bless another family through the donation center. Maybe it's still rocking a baby to sleep at this very moment. As for me, I no longer need that physical cradle to feel the weight of God's blessings. My heart is full, overflowing, really. Liam is in middle school, Ellie in 4th grade, and Mark is right alongside them. Sometimes I stand in the hallway at night, listening to their muffled giggles, and I'm reminded of the nursery I once hovered in, feeling such deep sorrow. The difference is, now, I realize that joy has many forms. It doesn't always come in the way we expect, and just because one door closes, a cradle carried away, doesn't mean new doors won't open in miraculous, life-altering ways. That's the story of my empty cradle. It started as a symbol of longing and ended up guiding me to a greater purpose. My name is Anna Thompson, and I've learned that trusting the shepherd doesn't mean you never walk through valleys. It means you keep going, step by step, even when the path is dark, trusting that his goodness and mercy will follow you all the days of your life. Indeed, they have. And my heart is anything but empty.